You're not even her real granddaughter." My father spat, his face contorted with rage. "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune." I stood frozen in grandmother Eleanor's study, the heavy oak shelves filled with leather-bound classics surrounding us like silent witnesses to his cruelty. The antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder than usual, marking each painful second of this confrontation. At 45, I thought I'd developed immunity to Robert Blackwell's coldness, but his words still cut deep, reopening old wounds I'd spent decades trying to heal. My grandmother had been buried only 3 days ago, and already the family was fracturing over her will. "What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. I gripped the edge of Eleanor's mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white. "Don't play innocent, Mary. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore." He paced the oriental rug, his Italian leather shoes pressing into the delicate fibers with each deliberate step. He paused to glare at the formal portrait of grandmother hanging above the fireplace, her wise eyes seeming to follow his movement. "Eleanor was obsessed with bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you've got no Blackwell blood, you'll get nothing." I looked him directly in the eyes, fighting to keep my voice steady. The afternoon sun streaming through the bay windows illuminated the silver at his temples, the deep lines of disapproval that had always marked his face when he looked at me. "Do you promise to keep your word about this? That only blood relatives deserve grandmother's inheritance?" "Absolutely," he declared, lifting his chin with the same imperious tilt I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. "I'll make sure the family legacy stays with real Blackwells, not imposters. My name is Mary Blackwell. I'm 45 years old, and until 5 minutes ago I believed Robert Blackwell was my biological father. Now, standing in my grandmother's Georgian mansion in suburban Philadelphia, surrounded by the trappings of old money and family history, I was apparently discovering otherwise. The portrait of my grandmother seemed to watch me with knowing eyes, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. What I wanted was simple: the fair treatment grandmother Eleanor intended in her will. She had specifically mentioned me, her only granddaughter, during our last conversation about her estate plans. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the study, Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn for 50 years. Standing in my way was the man who had always viewed me with thinly veiled contempt, the man whose approval I had spent decades trying to earn unsuccessfully. My stomach knotted as memories of childhood disappointments flooded back. Piano recitals he'd missed, achievements he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "You can attend the will reading next week if you must," he continued dismissively, brushing invisible lint from his tailored suit jacket. "But don't expect anything. I've already spoken with Walter about challenging any provisions that include you." Walter Price was my father's longtime friend and our family attorney. The mention of their apparent collusion sent a chill through me. I twisted the simple silver ring on my finger, a gift from grandmother on my 40th birthday, drawing strength from the connection to her. "I'll be there," I replied quietly. "Grandmother wanted me there." "Sentiment," he scoffed. "Eleanor always had a blind spot for you. Fortunately, the law cares about facts, not feelings." As he strode from the room, his cologne lingering in the air like a toxic cloud, I sank into grandmother's desk chair, running my fingers over the polished walnut surface where she had written countless letters, reviewed business documents, and most recently, finalized her will. The leather seat still held the impression of her small frame. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We need to talk about your father tonight, alone." I stared at the message, unease crawling up my spine like ivy on the mansion's exterior walls. If my father wasn't my biological father, then who was? And how had this secret remained hidden for 45 years? More importantly, why was it surfacing now, just days after grandmother's death and days before her fortune would be distributed? Whatever truth awaited me, one thing was becoming clear. The father I had spent my life trying to please had been harboring resentment far deeper than I had ever realized. Mary's reflections. Growing up as a Blackwell meant navigating a world of privilege and weighty expectations. The Blackwell fortune, built on pharmaceutical patents and shrewd investments, had sustained 3 generations of the family in considerable luxury. My father, Robert, was the elder of 2 sons, which automatically positioned him as the presumptive heir to the majority of the Blackwell assets. His younger brother, Michael, had been the family rebel, brilliant but restless, unwilling to conform to our grandfather's rigid vision of the family legacy. He'd left Philadelphia to pursue medical research in Seattle, returning only occasionally for major family events. My memories of Uncle Michael were limited but warm. His easy laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes, thoughtful gifts that showed he'd actually been listening when I spoke, and the way he'd address me as though my opinions mattered, a stark contrast to how the rest of the family treated me. In contrast, my relationship with my father had always been strained. Robert Blackwell was a man who measured worth in achievements and status, his gray eyes constantly evaluating, rarely approving. My brothers, David and Jonathan, had fulfilled his expectations admirably, David following him into the family business and rising to CEO by 40, Jonathan excelling in corporate law. I, however, had disappointed him at every turn. "She lacks the Blackwell drive," he'd remarked to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear, his voice carrying through the heating vent between the kitchen and my childhood bedroom. "Too soft, too unfocused." Despite graduating with honors and establishing a promising career in historical preservation, becoming the director of a respected nonprofit by 40, nothing I accomplished seemed to meet his standard. The constant disapproval had become like background noise in my life, always present, impossible to fully tune out. I'd attributed this perpetual disappointment to sexism, or perhaps unrealistic expectations, never imagining there might be a more fundamental reason for his distance. The realization that there might be a biological explanation for his coldness was both shocking and, in a strange way, validating. Perhaps I hadn't failed him after all. Perhaps I had never been his to begin with. Grandmother Eleanor had been my sanctuary. Unlike my father, she valued my interest in history and art, encouraging me to pursue a path that honored my passions rather than family tradition. During my undergraduate years, I'd visit her estate every Sunday for tea, listening to her stories of family history and her own quiet rebellions against the constraints placed on women of her generation. Even after my divorce 10 years ago, another disappointment in my father's eyes, she'd been my staunchest supporter. "Remember, Mary," she often told me, her fragile hands squeezing mine with surprising strength, "a Blackwell makes their own path." Her blue eyes, still sharp despite her advancing years, would hold mine steadily. "Never let anyone tell you who you are." Her death at 86 had been peaceful, but left an emptiness I was still struggling to navigate. The knowledge that I'd lost my greatest advocate within the family made her absence even more profound. In the days following her funeral, I'd noticed subtle changes in my father's behavior. Heightened scrutiny when I interacted with other family members, hushed conversations with Walter Price that abruptly ended when I entered a room. I dismissed these observations as grief manifesting in different ways. But now they took on a more sinister significance. The last time I'd seen grandmother alive, she'd held my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Mary. Not everything is as it appears." At the time, I'd attributed her cryptic words to medication or fatigue. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to prepare me for the storm that was about to break over our family. As I left grandmother's study to meet my mother, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a family drama decades in the making, one with roots deeper than I could yet comprehend. My sensible pumps clicked against the marble foyer as I gathered my coat and car keys, preparing to face whatever truth awaited me. Cafe meeting with Sarah. My mother was waiting for me at her favorite cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city where Blackwells were just ordinary people. Le Petit Coin was a small French bistro with faded red awnings and window boxes spilling over with geraniums. It was early evening, and the cafe was quiet, soft jazz playing in the background. Sarah Blackwell looked smaller somehow, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a simple chignon rather than her usual perfect coif, and her hands trembled slightly as she toyed with a napkin. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she began without preamble when I slid into the chair across from her, her fingers nervously turning her wedding band, a habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. "Your father, Robert, shouldn't have told you like that." It was cruel and self-serving. "So it's true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though we were the only customers in our corner of the cafe. The waiter placed 2 cups of Earl Grey in front of us, the steam rising like the questions between us. He's not my biological father. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, making the blue irises, so like mine, shimmer in the soft lighting of the cafe. It's complicated, Mary, more complicated than Robert makes it sound. Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a story that upended everything I thought I knew about my family. Her hands cradled her teacup as if seeking warmth while she spoke of a past I'd never known. She and Michael, my uncle, had been in love before she met Robert. They'd been young, passionate, and planning a future together when Michael received a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle. We agreed he should go, she explained, her voice tinged with the remnants of decades-old heartache. It was an incredible opportunity. We thought we could manage the distance, but the separation strained our relationship, and during a particularly difficult period, I grew close to Robert, who had always admired me from afar. A moment of vulnerability led to a brief relationship. One she ended when she realized her heart still belonged to Michael. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was certain it was Michael's child. The timing aligned perfectly with his last visit home. Her voice trembled as she reached across the table to take my hand. The cafe had filled up around us, but it felt like we were in our own bubble, the background noise fading as I focused entirely on her words. But Robert insisted the child was his, and Michael was already engaged to someone else by then. I didn't want to disrupt his new life. Robert had proposed immediately, presenting their marriage as the honorable solution. My mother looked down at our joined hands, her thumb tracing circles on my wrist just as she had done when I was a child needing comfort. Only later did I realize that his interest had never been entirely about me. The Blackwell fortune had strict inheritance provisions that favored male heirs with legitimate children. He needed a wife and children to secure his position, she said bitterly, a hardness I rarely saw flashing in her eyes. And I needed stability for my baby. It seemed like the best option at the time. Years passed, and the secret held. Michael eventually moved back to Philadelphia with his wife, but they remained childless. When his marriage ended in divorce, he threw himself into medical research, becoming increasingly distant from family affairs. Did Michael ever know? I asked, a surge of emotion rising in my chest at the thought of the man who might be my father, the man who had always shown me kindness, who had seen value in me when Robert could not. No, my mother whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. I couldn't bear to disrupt his life again. And as the years passed, it seemed crueler to reveal the truth. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. But Mary, you have to understand, I've always loved you. From the moment I knew you existed. Whatever mistakes I made, whatever choices, they were never about not wanting you. The revelation left me reeling. Every memory of childhood now required re-examination. My father's coldness, Uncle Michael's warmth during his rare visits, Grandmother Eleanor's special attention to me. The cafe continued its evening routine around us, waiters delivering plates, customers chatting, wine glasses clinking, while my world tilted on its axis. Why is Robert revealing this now? I finally asked, straightening my shoulders, trying to find my footing in this new reality. My mother's expression hardened, years of quiet submission giving way to protective anger. Your grandmother's will. He's always been obsessed with the Blackwell fortune, and now he's worried Eleanor might have left you a significant portion. He needs to discredit your claim. But if I'm not a blood Blackwell... That's just it, she interrupted, leaning closer, her voice dropping even lower. You are a Blackwell by blood, just not Robert's child. You're Michael's daughter, which makes you Eleanor's granddaughter by blood regardless. The irony was almost too perfect. My father's attempt to cut me out of the inheritance by denying our biological connection might actually strengthen my claim through a different branch of the family tree. A disbelieving laugh escaped me before I could suppress it. What do I do now? I asked, feeling adrift in this new reality, like a ship whose anchor had suddenly been lifted. My mother reached across the table to clasp my hands. Her fingers were cool against my skin, but her grip was firm, resolute. That depends on what you want, Mary. Justice, acknowledgement, or simply your fair share of what Eleanor intended for you. I didn't have an answer yet. The betrayal was too fresh, the implications too vast to process in a single conversation. But as we left the cafe, walking together into the cool Philadelphia evening, one certainty crystallized in my mind. I would not allow Robert Blackwell to rewrite my history for his financial gain. The question was how to prove my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would help or harm my position in the complex web of Blackwell inheritance rules. As I hugged my mother goodbye by her car, the streetlights casting our shadows long against the pavement, I felt simultaneously untethered from my past and more determined about my future than I had in years. Meeting with Michael. The next morning, I drove to Uncle Michael's apartment, heart hammering against my ribs. The late October sun cast a golden glow over Philadelphia's tree-lined streets, leaves crunching beneath my tires as I parked in front of his building. I had called ahead, keeping my reason vague. Family matters to discuss before the will reading. Now, sitting in his modest living room, surrounded by scientific journals and travel mementos, I struggled to find the words to upend his world alongside mine. Unlike the Blackwell mansion with its imposing grandeur, Michael's apartment was warm and lived in. Bookshelves overflowed with medical texts and volumes on global health. Photos from his research trips adorned the walls, Michael with doctors in Tanzania, with children in a rural Indian clinic. At 64, he still had the lean build of a man who prioritized health, though silver had completely replaced the dark hair I remembered from my childhood. "You seem troubled, Mary," he observed, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table. Despite the decade age difference between the brothers, Michael looked younger than Robert, his face less hardened by ambition and disappointment. His dark eyes, the same ones I saw in my mirror every morning, studied me with genuine concern. "Is Robert making things difficult about Eleanor's estate?" I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, drawing courage from its heat. "It's more complicated than that," I began, then faltered. "How did one ask a man if he might be your biological father?" The question that had kept me awake all night now stuck in my throat. I took a deep breath and met his gaze directly. "Uncle Michael, did you and my mother, were you ever together before she married father?" The cup froze halfway to his lips, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded caution. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a long-buried memory surfacing. "Why would you ask about ancient history now?" "Because Robert has informed me that he's not my biological father, and he's using that claim to challenge my place in grandmother's will." The words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. Michael set his cup down with deliberate care, the porcelain making barely a sound against the wooden table. "That sounds like Robert, calculating even in cruelty." He studied my face with new intensity, as though seeing it for the first time. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing seconds with steady ticks. "What has your mother told you?" I recounted my mother's revelations about their past relationship, watching his expressions cycle through nostalgia, pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. His hands, surgeon's hands with long, elegant fingers, hands that resembled my own, gripped his knees as he listened. "I never knew," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Catherine never told me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the marriage, it was already done." He leaned forward, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. "Mary, are you saying you believe I might be your father?" The directness of his question, spoken without pretense or evasion, was so unlike the careful dance of words I was accustomed to in the Blackwell household. "The timing fits, according to mother," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "But Robert is determined to prove I have no Blackwell blood to claim my inheritance." Michael's expression darkened, a flash of the famous Blackwell temper I'd seen so rarely from him. "Eleanor's will specifically mentions you by name. Robert can't simply write you out of it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false pretenses, namely that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter." Michael rose abruptly, pacing the small room. His reflected image passed across the framed photographs, a moving reminder of all the years we lost. "This is absurd. Even if you were not Robert's biological child, you're still Eleanor's granddaughter if you're my daughter." He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. "We need to know for certain." A DNA test would settle this question definitively. The clinical simplicity of his solution both relieved and terrified me. The scientific approach, so characteristic of the researcher he was. "You'd be willing to take one?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so straightforward. Without hesitation, he replied, his voice softening as he returned to his seat across from me. I've always felt a connection to you that I couldn't quite explain. When you were a child, your curiosity, your way of looking at the world. He broke off, emotion momentarily overwhelming him. If you are my daughter, his voice caught. Well, let's confirm the facts before we get ahead of ourselves. We arranged for expedited testing that same day, using a private lab that promised results within 72 hours, just enough time before the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a strange combination of dread and anticipation settled in my stomach. The antiseptic smell of the lab, the efficient movements of the technician, the paperwork with our names side by side, it all seemed surreal. Regardless of the outcome, my relationship with both men would be irrevocably altered. As we walked back to our cars, Michael paused. Mary, whatever the results show, I want you to know something. His voice was steady, though his eyes revealed his emotion. I've always been proud of you. The work you do preserving our history, the person you've become, it matters. It has always mattered. The simple words, spoken without agenda or calculation, brought tears to my eyes. In all my 45 years, Robert had never once expressed pride in my accomplishments. That Michael could do so, even before knowing if we shared blood, told me everything about the kind of man he was. Thank you, I managed, blinking back the moisture in my eyes. That means more than you know. We parted with a promise to call as soon as either of us heard anything. As I watched him drive away, I wondered what might have been if my mother had made different choices all those years ago, if I had grown up as Michael's daughter rather than Robert's. The autumn wind whipped around me, carrying away the thought like the fallen leaves swirling at my feet. Legal maneuvering. While awaiting results, I attempted to gather information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, Henry Collins, separate from the family lawyer, Walter Price. Collins had been Eleanor's trusted advisor for decades, a dignified man in his mid-70s who had always treated me with kindness during my visits to grandmother. His office was a stark contrast to the gleaming, modern space that Walter Price maintained. Located in a historic brownstone, it featured dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books, and furnishings that had likely been there since the 1970s. The smell of lemon polish and old paper filled the air as his secretary, a woman nearly as old as he was, showed me in. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, Henry explained when I visited his office. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he regarded me with sympathy from behind his cluttered desk. But I can assure you that your grandmother was of sound mind and very clear about her intentions. Did she know? I asked directly, leaning forward slightly in my chair. About my biological parentage? Henry's carefully neutral expression slipped momentarily, a flash of confirmation in his eyes before the professional mask returned. I cannot comment on that, but I will say that Eleanor Blackwell was a remarkably perceptive woman who very little escaped her notice. His non-answer told me everything I needed to know. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was Michael's daughter, not Robert's. The realization brought both comfort and apprehension. My momentary triumph evaporated when I received a formal letter that evening, delivered by courier to my townhouse. Walter Price had petitioned the court to delay the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. I stared at the legal document, its cold, formal language a perfect reflection of Robert's calculating nature. He was moving faster than anticipated, using his legal connections to buy time while he built his case against me. When I called Henry to ask about the delay, his secretary informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. I clutched the phone, my suspicion immediate and jarring. It couldn't be coincidence. Robert was systematically removing my potential allies and information sources. Without Henry or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a severe disadvantage. The thought made my stomach churn as I paced the hardwood floors of my living room, the city lights glimmering through the windows as evening fell. That night, my mother called in a panic. "Robert knows you met with Michael," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He's furious, Mary. Be careful. When Robert feels threatened, he becomes dangerous." "How could he possibly know?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. In the Blackwell world, money bought information, loyalty, surveillance. "Your brother David saw you leaving Michael's building," she explained. "He mentioned it to Jonathan, Who told Robert? The family network that had always felt suffocating now seemed actively malevolent. What exactly do you mean by dangerous? I pressed, needing to understand the scope of the threat. My mother's hesitation spoke volumes. Not physically, she finally said. But Robert has connections everywhere. Banks, businesses, the charity board you serve on. He won't hesitate to make things difficult for you professionally. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen island, staring into a glass of wine I couldn't bring myself to drink. The threat felt real, but something in me had shifted. The decades of seeking Robert's approval, of measuring my worth through his critical eyes, had suddenly lost their power. Whether by nature or nurture, I realized I had inherited Eleanor's steel. Robert hadn't counted on that. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document on my tablet, scanning for the conclusion buried amid scientific terminology. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. Michael Blackwell was unquestionably my biological father. I sat back on my sofa, emotions flooding through me. Vindication, grief for the relationship I never had, anger at the years of deception. The morning light filtered through my curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, just like this moment of revelation. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. Robert, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called Michael, who received the news with quiet emotion. I suspected from the moment you asked, he admitted, his voice warm through the phone. You have Sarah's smile, but those eyes, they're Blackwell eyes. My mother's eyes. We agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against Robert, or so I thought. That evening, Walter Price requested an urgent meeting at his office. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from Robert's, no, not my father's, legal ally. The elegant offices of Price and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Located in one of Philadelphia's premier office towers, the space featured mahogany paneling, abstract art worth small fortunes, and views of the city that emphasized the firm's position at the top of the legal food chain. Walter, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. Mary, thank you for coming, he said, gesturing me to a leather chair across from his vast desk. I thought we should discuss certain developments before the will reading. You mean the fact that Robert isn't my biological father, or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading? I kept my voice even, but let the anger simmer just beneath the surface. His smile tightened, creating new lines around his mouth. Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and Michael arranged. My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? The test had been meticulously private, conducted at a lab with no connection to the Blackwell family. Robert was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation, Walter continued, straightening a pen on his desk with manicured fingers. He asked me to convey a proposal. He slid a document across his desk, its heavy cream paper embossed with the firm's letterhead. It was a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Eleanor Blackwell's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $250,000. This is absurd, I said, pushing it back without even reading the details. The paper felt contaminated, toxic. Grandmother specifically included me in her will. Yes, under the presumption you were Robert's daughter. Now that we know otherwise. Now we know I'm Michael's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Eleanor's granddaughter than if I were Robert's, I interrupted, straightening my shoulders and meeting his gaze directly. Blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Isn't that what Robert always says? Walter's expression shifted. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, or at least reassessment, in his eyes. There are complexities you're unaware of, Mary. Legal nuances regarding the Blackwell Trust that supersede simple biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Robert is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests. The veiled threat hung between us in the air-conditioned silence of his office. I stood, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calmness I didn't feel. Thank you for your time, Walter. I'll see you at the reading. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Walter's confidence despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. As the elevator descended to the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The final revelation. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. Michael called, his voice tight with controlled fury. Mary, I've just received some disturbing information from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my father decades ago. He paused, and I could hear him taking a steadying breath. Robert isn't biologically a Blackwell. What? The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter for support, the marble cool beneath my suddenly clammy fingers. The coffee I'd been drinking turned bitter in my mouth. Apparently, my parents adopted Robert as an infant after my mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Robert to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My free hand went to my chest, as if I could somehow contain the explosion of understanding. If Robert wasn't a blood Blackwell, then by his own logic, does Robert know? I managed, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I don't think so. Our parents took the secret to their graves. But Eleanor might have known. She and my mother were extremely close. Michael's voice had the careful precision of a scientist laying out facts, but underneath I could hear his own shock and confusion. That's why Walter was so confident, I breathed, the pieces suddenly fitting together like a complex puzzle. There must be something in the will or trust document specifying blood relations. Exactly. I've been reviewing copies of the original Blackwell Trust. There's a specific clause requiring direct bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Robert would have been protected by his legal adoption. But by making this about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself. The irony was almost too perfect. I sank onto one of my kitchen stools, suddenly lightheaded. Robert's attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Blackwell line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. The man who had spent his life ensuring the Blackwell name remained prestigious, only to discover he had no biological right to it himself. What do we do with this information? I asked, my mind racing through potential scenarios. Michael was quiet for a moment. Through the phone, I could hear the familiar sound of him pacing, something he always did when deep in thought. That depends on what you want, Mary. What Robert deserves and what's right for our family might be different things. I considered his words carefully. The anger and hurt of decades couldn't be erased by one revelation, but neither did I want to reduce myself to Robert's level of cruelty. Still, his own words returned to me. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. I think, I said slowly, running my finger along the counter's edge, that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own standards. Don't you? Michael's soft chuckle carried a hint of the famous Blackwell vindictiveness that perhaps ran in our shared blood after all. We'll see you tomorrow at the reading then. 9 am sharp. The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, Philadelphia's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside grandmother's mansion where the family had gathered. I arrived early with Michael, our shared secret, a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. We sat in his car for a moment, watching other family members arrive, my brothers David and Jonathan, looking uncomfortable but determined, various cousins and their spouses, and finally Robert and my mother in separate vehicles, their decades-old marriage as divided as their arrival. Ready? Michael asked, his hand briefly covering mine on the leather seat between us. I nodded, drawing strength from this new alliance. As I'll ever be. Walter Price presided from the head of the dining table, leather portfolio open before him, while various Blackwell relatives filled the high-backed chairs. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, catching on the crystal chandelier and sending prisms of color dancing across the polished mahogany. Robert sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my brothers who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. Before we begin, Walter announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in law. I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility. Robert straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. The pearl cufflinks at his wrist caught the light as he adjusted his position, clearly anticipating victory. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Eleanor Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Blackwell family trust. My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Her fingers were cold, but steady. Across from us, I watched Robert's face, the slight upturn of his lips, the gleam in his eyes that had always appeared when he thought he'd won. Walter continued, his tone measured and professional. As you know, Eleanor's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Blackwell line, which is precisely why we need to address Mary's situation. Robert interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying the confident timbre of a man accustomed to being listened to. Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter and therefore has no claim to the Blackwell inheritance. A ripple of murmur circulated around the table. Michael and I exchanged glances. Our carefully rehearsed plans suddenly derailed by Robert's preemptive strike. I have DNA evidence, Robert continued, sliding a folder toward Walter, the movement deliberate and theatrical. Confirming Mary is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution. My heart pounded as Walter reviewed the documents, the rustle of papers impossibly loud in the tense silence. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Robert had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing. Testing I had never consented to or provided samples for. May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test? I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Robert's smile was cold, reminding me of a predator certain of its prey. From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really. That's illegal, Michael interjected, the edge in his voice noticeable. Unauthorized DNA testing. Irrelevant to the inheritance question, Walter cut in, glancing apologetically at Michael before continuing. The science is sound, regardless of collection methods. I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Walter accepted Robert's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. The family members around the table were watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. My brothers avoided my gaze entirely. I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question, I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. The manila envelope felt warm in my hands, like it contained not just paper, but a live current of truth. DNA confirmation that Michael Blackwell is my biological father. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Cousin Margaret actually gasped audibly. Jonathan's jaw literally dropped, while David's face remained carefully neutral, though his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. But it was Robert's reaction that held the room, his face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. You. He seemed unable to form words, decades of controlled emotion finally breaking through the facade. This changes nothing, Walter insisted after reviewing our documentation, though his confidence seemed slightly shaken. The trust specifies Blackwell blood from Eleanor's direct line, which flows through her son Robert to his legitimate heirs. It was the opening we needed. Michael stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. At 64, he still carried himself with the straight-back poise of the surgeon he was, his gaze steady as it swept across the assembled family. I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust, he said, his research scientist precision evident in every measured word. My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Blackwell, Eleanor's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem. Walter frowned, lines deepening between his eyebrows. What problem? Robert is not biologically a Blackwell, Michael stated clearly, his voice neither triumphant nor apologetic, simply matter of fact. He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Eleanor was aware of. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hesitate between ticks. Robert's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. The breakfast china rattled slightly as his hand trembled against the table. That's absurd, he finally sputtered, his voice higher than normal. A desperate lie. I have the adoption records, Michael continued implacably. And DNA confirmation. He produced another folder, this one worn with age. If we're applying a strict bloodline test as Robert insists, then I am Eleanor's only biological child, and Mary, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild. Walter looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to Robert visibly warring with his professional obligations. The yellowed paper of the adoption certificate, the faded ink of signatures long dead, the modern precision of DNA analysis, all of it building an irrefutable case. "This is outrageous," Robert shouted, rising from his chair with such force that it skidded backward on the hardwood floor. "I won't stand for this slander. You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune," I reminded him quietly, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. "Are you retracting that position now?" Before Robert could respond, the library doors opened to reveal a frail but determined Henry Collins, grandmother's personal attorney, leaning on a cane. His suit hung slightly loose on his thin frame, evidence of his recent illness, but his eyes were sharp and clear as they swept the room. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said, nodding to me. "I believe my presence is required for this reading." Walter's dismay confirmed our suspicion. Henry's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering Robert had orchestrated in his absence. The two attorneys exchanged a look that spoke volumes about professional rivalry and differing loyalties. "Henry," Walter managed, recovering quickly, "we're glad to see you recovered. We were just addressing some preliminary matters." "So I gather," Henry replied dryly, making his way to a seat at the table with the careful movements of the recently ill. "I would like to review the documents before proceeding." As Henry settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before him, Robert looked truly afraid for the first time. His usual mask of confident control had slipped, revealing the insecurity of a man whose identity was suddenly in question. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Walter was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. I felt a strange mix of emotions watching him, satisfaction at seeing justice served, yes, but also an unexpected pang of empathy. In his own way, Robert had been a victim of secrets too. The will reading. Henry adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the final pages of grandmother's will, his voice steady and authoritative despite his recent illness. The room had fallen into an uneasy silence, the family divided between shock, curiosity, and, in Robert's case, barely contained fury. Before addressing specific bequests, Henry announced, looking up from the documents, "I must draw attention to a letter Eleanor Blackwell instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding." He opened a sealed envelope, the Blackwell crest embossed on heavy cream paper, the wax seal breaking with a soft crack that seemed to echo in the tense room. The family leaned forward collectively, united at least in their curiosity. I noticed my mother's eyes fill with tears, as if she somehow knew what was coming. Michael remained perfectly still beside me, his face composed but alert. Henry cleared his throat and began to read. "To my family gathered here, if this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Robert was not born of Blackwell blood but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known, since the moment I first held her, that Mary is Michael's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Blackwell Trust established by my father requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Blackwell fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Robert, you have been my son in every way that matters, but your treatment of Mary, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Blackwell name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet." Henry paused, looking directly at Robert, whose face had gone ashen. The morning sunlight cast harsh shadows across his features, emphasizing the shock and disbelief etched there. The room remained absolutely silent, the weight of Eleanor's words hanging in the air like suspended dust motes. In accordance with Eleanor's explicit instructions, Henry continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Robert's adoption and Mary's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Blackwell bloodline descended to Michael Blackwell and his biological daughter, Mary. Eleanor's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here. Robert lunged for the documents, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "This can't be legal," he sputtered, his voice breaking. She was senile, manipulated. Henry calmly shifted the papers away, his frail appearance belying a core of steel. Eleanor Blackwell was of sound mind until her passing. Her instructions were meticulously documented and witnessed. I personally attested to her mental acuity. "You promised," Robert shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. His finger jabbed the air between us accusingly. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." "No," I corrected him quietly, meeting his gaze steadily. "You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it, and you promised you would." The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Robert's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The family fortune he had coveted and protected wasn't truly his by the standards he himself had established. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. David and Jonathan exchanged glances, clearly processing the implications for their own positions. As Robert's sons, though not blood Blackwells by the trust definition, their stake in the family legacy was suddenly in question too. Walter looked stunned, his legal maneuvering undone by Eleanor's foresight. He shuffled papers without really seeing them, a man suddenly uncertain of his footing. Henry continued with the reading, outlining specific bequests and provisions. The family home would remain a shared family asset. Various personal items and heirlooms were distributed among family members, including, touchingly, Eleanor's collection of first edition classics to me, books we had discussed during our Sunday teas. Charitable donations were specified for causes Eleanor had championed throughout her life. Throughout the reading, I felt strangely detached, as if observing the scene from a distance. The inheritance, while substantial, seemed almost secondary to the truth that had been revealed. My identity, my place in the family, had been affirmed by the grandmother who had always seen me clearly. The validation was worth more than any financial bequest. As Henry concluded, Robert stormed from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like angry thunder. Walter gathered his documents with shaking hands, mumbling apologies as he followed. The remaining family members sat in stunned silence for several moments. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I believe we all need time to process what we've learned today. Perhaps we could reconvene tomorrow to discuss practical matters." Nods of agreement rippled around the table as family members began to disperse, casting curious glances my way. I remained seated, feeling suddenly exhausted, as if the adrenaline that had carried me through the morning had abruptly drained away. "Are you all right?" Michael asked softly when we were nearly alone. "I think so," I replied, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Just overwhelmed." He nodded, understanding. "It's a lot to take in. For all of us." The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. Robert, undone by his own machinations, retreated to his office at Blackwell Pharmaceuticals, issuing statements through Walter about potential legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. The company's stock dipped briefly on rumors of family discord before stabilizing, the markets ultimately indifferent to personal drama. Walter Price followed Robert into professional isolation, his reputation tarnished after Henry revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. The legal community's whispered judgments would likely hurt more than any formal censure. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly in the mansion's foyer as others departed. David, always the more business-minded of the two, spoke first. "This changes things at the company," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The board will have questions about succession planning. I have no interest in taking over," I assured him, recognizing his real concern. "The preservation work I do is my passion." "That hasn't changed." He nodded, visibly relieved. Jonathan, more emotionally transparent than his brother, stepped forward. "I had no idea about any of this," he said quietly, hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets. All those years, the way he treated you. It makes a terrible kind of sense now. David nodded soberly. For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed. Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by Robert too, in different ways. Perhaps there was a relationship worth salvaging there, given time. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot. Mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. The weight of decades of secrecy seemed to have lifted from her shoulders, but uncertainty about the future remained in her eyes. I should have told you years ago, she said, clasping my hands in hers. You were protecting me, I finished for her, squeezing her fingers gently. I understand that now. And Robert, she added softly. Even him. He believed you were his for so long. Finding out at 27 would have been devastating. At 68, she shook her head. I don't know if he'll ever recover from this. The most profound conversation came later that evening when Michael and I sat in grandmother's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. The autumn evening had brought an early dusk, and we sat in the warm glow of the desk lamp that had illuminated Eleanor's correspondence for decades. What will you do now? He asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. I traced the leather inlay of the desk, considering. Build something new, I answered simply. We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward. He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. The set of our eyes, the curve of our mouths when thoughtful, it was like looking in a mirror across a generational divide. I'd like that very much, he said quietly. As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt grandmother's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, Robert's downfall came not from my actions but from his own character revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect and perfectly sufficient. As I looked toward the future, a future that included a father who actually wanted me in his life, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all, the truth that had set me free from a lifetime of seeking approval from a man who could never give it. Grandmother Eleanor had left me more than money or property. She had given me the key to understanding my past and the freedom to create my future on my own terms, unburdened by false expectations or misplaced loyalties. In her final act of love, she had secured not just my financial inheritance, but my emotional liberation as well. The spotlight feels heavy on my skin as I climb the steps to the stage. The applause echoes through the grand ballroom of the Aspen Heights Hotel, but all I can hear is the thundering of my own heart. This is it, the moment I've been working toward for months. As the presenter hands me the Gleaming Crystal Award for Best New Boutique Hotel in Colorado, I catch a glimpse of them in the back of the room, my parents. Mom's face is a careful mask, but I can see the slight tremble in her hand as she clutches her purse. Dad looks somehow smaller than I remember, his shoulders hunched forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I can't quite read. 500 people are watching, waiting for my acceptance speech, but for a moment, I'm frozen in time, transported back to that devastating afternoon 8 months ago when everything changed. When I realized that 20 years of experience, 8 months of exhausting work, and a lifetime of dedication meant nothing compared to being the son. Olivia Morrison, ladies and gentlemen. The presenter's voice breaks through my reverie, and I step up to the microphone. Thank you. I begin, my voice steadier than I feel. They say success is the best revenge, but I've learned it's something far more powerful, it's freedom. Flashback, the betrayal. What do you mean Michael will be CEO? I'm the one who saved this hotel. My voice echoed through the newly renovated lobby, bouncing off the mountain-inspired decor I'd spent months perfecting. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the stunned faces of the staff gathered for what I thought would be a celebration of our record-breaking quarter. Mom's dismissive wave felt like a physical blow. Olivia, honey, your brother has more natural leadership ability. You're too detail-oriented, she said, as if explaining something to a child rather than a 55-year-old woman with decades of industry experience. That's when Michael strolled in, hands in his pockets, wearing that same smug smile I'd seen since we were kids playing in the halls of this very hotel. Hey sis, don't take it personally. Someone needs to handle the day-to-day stuff while I focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture. As if I hadn't been the one who modernized every system, retrained the staff, redesigned the interiors, and gotten us featured in 3 major travel magazines. As if I hadn't been the one who'd saved our family legacy from bankruptcy when Dad called me in tears just 8 months ago. I felt Deborah's eyes on me, our head of guest services who'd been with the Mountain Pine Lodge for 20 years. She knew. Everyone knew. But like me, they were forced to stand there and watch this farce play out, pretending this was somehow normal or fair. I remember how my hands trembled as I gripped the presentation folder containing our quarterly results, the proof of everything I'd accomplished. The folder I would never get to open that day. I need some air, I managed to say, surprising myself with how calm I sounded when inside I was screaming. Flashback. The history. The Mountain Pine Lodge has been our family's legacy since my grandparents built it in 1971. While other children played house, I played hotel manager, helping Mom with check-ins and watching Dad fix leaky faucets. I still remember the pride in my grandfather's eyes when I told him I was going to college for hospitality management. That's my girl, he'd said, his weathered hands squeezing mine. This place will be yours someday. But life rarely follows the paths we imagine. While I was building my career in Chicago, climbing from front desk manager to regional director for Centennial Hotels, my younger brother Michael was busy being the golden child despite his perpetual state of finding himself. He's just more creative than you, Mom would say during our Sunday calls. He sees the big picture. Meanwhile, I was overseeing 15 hotels across 3 states, but somehow that never seemed to impress them. I've often wondered if things would have been different if I had married, had children, fulfilled the other set of expectations they had for me. But my marriage ended 5 years ago after a decade of growing apart. Richard wanted a wife who would be home more, who wouldn't be taking business calls during dinner. I wanted a partner who understood my dedication to my career wasn't a rejection of him, but simply who I was. You'll regret choosing your job over a family, Mom had said when I told her about the divorce. Another prediction she was wrong about, but one that still stung. My daughter Emma, now 28 and teaching in Seattle, was the only one who truly understood. You deserve to be recognized for your work, Mom, she told me over the phone last Christmas. Don't let them make you feel small. Flashback. The call in return. The call came on a snowy January morning. I was in my Chicago apartment, reviewing quarterly projections, when my phone lit up with Dad's name. Olivia, we're in trouble, he said, his voice breaking. The bank is threatening foreclosure. We're barely making payroll. I flew out the next day. What I found was worse than I expected. Outdated systems, untrained staff, and online reviews that made me cringe. Stuck in the past. Read one. Not worth the price, said another. The carpeting was worn, the decor dated, and the once proud Mountain Pine Lodge had become a sad shadow of its former glory. What happened? I asked my parents over dinner that first night. The economy, Dad muttered, staring into his whiskey. Competition, Mom added, fiddling with her napkin. These new fancy places with their spas and organic restaurants. But I knew better. It was mismanagement, pure and simple. Decades of refusing to adapt, of cutting corners instead of investing, of resting on the laurels of a reputation that was fading fast. Still, this was my family, my heritage. I called my boss the next day and took a leave of absence. I sold my condo, emptied my savings account, and dived into the rescue mission with everything I had. The first month was just damage control, fixing broken equipment, updating the booking system, training staff on basic customer service. Every night, I'd fall into bed exhausted, only to wake up before dawn and start again. Michael showed up occasionally, always with big ideas but never with the willingness to do the actual work. We should have DJ nights in the lounge, he'd suggest, or what if we turned the West Wing into luxury condos? Then he'd be gone again, back to Denver to network, while I was elbow deep in spreadsheets and vendor negotiations. Yet somehow, in our parents' eyes, his occasional input was just as valuable as my 16-hour days. Your brother has such vision, Mom would gush after one of his flying visits. He can really see what this place could become. And I would bite my tongue, reminding myself why I was doing this. Not for their approval, but for the lodge, for the staff who depended on it, for the legacy my grandparents had built. Flashback, the success and betrayal. By April, the transformation was becoming visible. The new booking system was streamlined, the staff was energized by the changes, and the renovated lobby drew gasps from returning guests. I'd leveraged my industry connections to get us featured in travel magazines, and it worked. Our bookings doubled, and for the first time in years, we were turning a profit. I remember the morning I finalized the quarterly report, my heart racing with pride. We'd exceeded even my most optimistic projections. I couldn't wait to present the results at the staff meeting to show my parents concrete proof of what we'd accomplished together. That was the meeting where they announced Michael as the new CEO. I learned later that the decision had been made weeks earlier. While I was rescuing their hotel, they were preparing to hand it over to my brother. That evening, I sat alone in my room at the lodge, surrounded by the printouts of guest reviews, revenue charts, and staff evaluations, all the evidence of what I'd achieved. I thought about all the times in my life when I'd worked twice as hard for half the recognition, about how no matter what I accomplished, it was never quite enough. I can't do this anymore, I whispered to the empty room. At the Riverside Lodge, the for sale sign on the old Riverside Lodge caught my eye as I was driving aimlessly that evening, trying to clear my head. The property had been our main competitor for years before falling into disrepair last season. I pulled into the empty parking lot, my mind racing. The building was weathered, with peeling paint and overgrown landscaping, but I could see beyond that to what it could become. It had better views than Mountain Pine, closer proximity to the ski slopes, and a much larger spa space. As I peered through dusty windows, I could envision a modern lobby with comfortable seating areas, a farm-to-table restaurant, rooms that blended luxury with environmental consciousness. I sat in my car for almost an hour, thinking about every time my parents had overlooked me in favor of Michael, every achievement dismissed, every suggestion second-guessed, every contribution minimized. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, when something inside me shifted. It wasn't a snap or a break. It was more like pieces falling into place. I called Emma. I'm thinking of buying a hotel, I said without preamble. There was a pause, then her warm laugh. Of course you are. Is this about Grandpa and Grandma choosing Uncle Michael? It's about me, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. It's about creating something that's mine, where my experience and vision are valued. Then do it, Mom, she said simply. Do it for you. The next day, I called a realtor. By the end of the week, I had made an offer on the Riverside Lodge. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a spark of genuine excitement. I wouldn't have to watch Michael dismantle everything I built. Instead, I would build something new, something completely mine. I named it The Summit, perhaps a bit on the nose, but I wanted to make a statement. This wasn't just about competing with Mountain Pine, it was about reaching new heights, about refusing to be constrained by others' limited vision of who I could be. Building the summit, the next 6 months were a whirlwind of activity. I poured everything I had, my savings, my experience, my connections, into transforming the rundown Riverside Lodge into the summit. While Michael was busy hosting parties at Mountain Pine, I was working with contractors, redesigning spaces, and building a team of hospitality professionals who shared my vision. Word got around town quickly. Some called me spiteful for competing with my own family. My mother's friends, pillars of the local community, began to give me the cold shoulder at the grocery store. How could you do this to your family? Mom asked during a tense phone call. After everything we've done for you? I wanted to laugh at the irony. Everything they'd done for me? Like dismissing 20 years of career success? Like handing my brother the fruits of my labor? I'm not doing anything to you, I replied calmly. I'm doing something for myself. Meanwhile, Michael's mismanagement was taking its toll on Mountain Pine. Their online reviews started dropping, complaints about inconsistent service, maintenance issues, even cleanliness problems. Three longtime staff members quit within the first month of his leadership, including Charlotte, the head of housekeeping who'd been there for 18 years. He wanted me to cut corners on cleaning supplies, she told me when she came to apply for a position at the summit. Said guests don't notice the difference. I hired her on the spot, along with several other experienced women from Mountain Pine who were tired of having their expertise ignored. Deborah joined us as well, bringing with her decades of knowledge about guest preferences and local attractions. It's different here, Deborah told me one evening as we reviewed the hiring plan for our opening. You actually listen when we make suggestions. I thought about my own mother, who had worked alongside my father for 40 years but was always introduced as the wife rather than the co-owner. I thought about all the women I'd met in this industry whose contributions were minimized or overlooked. And I made a silent promise that the summit would be different, a place where experience was valued regardless of gender or age. The grand opening. The summit's grand opening was exactly 6 months after that fateful day in the Mountain Pine lobby. The transformation was complete. From the locally sourced artwork adorning the walls to the state-of-the-art booking system, from the farm-to-table restaurant to the eco-friendly amenities in each room. I invited my parents and Michael, not expecting them to come. But they did, walking in just as the local newspaper photographer was taking pictures of me cutting the ribbon. I'll never forget their faces, Mom's tight smile barely hiding her shock, Dad's wide eyes taking in the packed reception area, and Michael's barely concealed anger. You're trying to destroy us, Michael hissed when he cornered me by the bar later that evening. This is a direct attack on our family. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a strange sense of clarity. All my life, I'd been trying to earn my family's approval, to prove my worth to them. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need it anymore. No, Michael, I replied, my voice steady. This is me succeeding despite our family. The contrast between the two hotels became increasingly stark over the following months. While Mountain Pines struggled with basic maintenance and dwindling bookings, the summit quickly gained a reputation for excellence. We focused on sustainable practices, partnered with local businesses, and created a workplace where every employee felt valued. But success brought its own challenges. The tourism board, where my father had connections, suddenly found a conflict of interest with my membership. Some vendors were pressured not to work with us. Mom's social circle began spreading rumors about my betrayal of family values. I weathered it all, finding new vendors in Denver when local ones hesitated, building direct relationships with tour operators when traditional channels closed. Every obstacle just made me more determined to succeed on my own terms. The confrontation. Then came the day my parents showed up at my office unannounced. They looked older, worried, as they sat across from my desk, Mom clutching her purse like a shield, Dad slumped slightly in his chair. The bank is threatening to call Mountain Pines loans, Dad finally said after awkward small talk about the weather. Michael's struggling. We're family, Mom added, leaning forward. You can't just let the hotel fail. I looked at them both, these people who had shaped me in so many ways, both through what they gave me and what they withheld. And I felt strangely calm. I offered to help 8 months ago, I replied, my voice steady. You chose Michael. Now you have to live with that choice. Dad tried appealing to my sense of legacy. Your grandfather built that hotel from nothing, he said quietly. It's been in our family for generations, and I tried to preserve that legacy, I counted. You're the ones who handed it to someone who treats it like his personal playground. Mom's face hardened. So that's it. Revenge? You'll let Mountain Pine fail just to prove a point? I took a deep breath. This isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. I'll give you advice if you want it. I can recommend strategies, suppliers, even training programs for the staff. But I'm not coming back to fix what Michael has broken. That's not my responsibility anymore. They didn't know what to say. Dad finally muttered something about understanding my position, but the disappointment on his face was clear. Mom looked like she wanted to argue more, but for once, she didn't push it. As I watched them leave, I felt a weight lifting, a burden I'd been carrying for longer than I realized. I wasn't responsible for saving them anymore. I wasn't responsible for earning their approval. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly choosing myself. The awards ceremony present, and now, standing on this stage with the Best Boutique Hotel award in my hands, I look out at the sea of faces. My team is in the front row, cheering wildly, Deborah, Charlotte, and all the others who took a chance on my vision. My daughter Emma flew in from Seattle for the ceremony, her proud smile warming my heart. I want to thank my team, I say into the microphone. The summit isn't just my achievement, it's ours. Every person who believed in this vision, who brought their experience and dedication to make it a reality, this award belongs to all of you. I pause, then continue. I also want to thank Mountain Pine Lodge, where I first fell in love with hospitality. Our roots shape us, even when we grow in unexpected directions. I don't explicitly mention my parents, but as I say these words, I glance toward the back of the room where they sit. Dad gives me a small nod, and Mom's eyes glisten with what might be tears. It's not quite an apology, but it's an acknowledgement, something I'd long since stopped expecting but still appreciate in its own way. After the ceremony, I join my team in celebrating. My parents don't approach me, and I don't go to them. This is my moment, and I want to share it with the people who helped me achieve it. Later that night, as the celebration winds down, Emma links her arm through mine. I'm so proud of you, Mom, she says. Not just for the award, but for everything, for having the courage to start over, for creating something amazing on your own terms. Her words touch something deep inside me. At 55, I've built a successful business, mentored a team of talented professionals, and finally broken free from the need for my family's approval. I've discovered that success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you're capable, deserving, and enough. Epilogue. The following spring. Spring arrives, bringing new growth to the mountains. The summit continues to thrive, and I've been invited to join the State Tourism Committee, a recognition that extends beyond our small town's politics. I'm having coffee on the summit's terrace, enjoying the morning sunshine, when I receive a text from my mother asking if we can meet. We haven't spoken much since the awards ceremony 3 months ago. We meet at a neutral spot, a small cafe halfway between our hotels. She looks older, more hesitant as she slides into the booth across from me. The consultant you recommended has been helpful, she begins, stirring her tea unnecessarily. Michael is learning. Slowly. I nod, waiting for her to continue. Your father and I have been talking, she says finally. About retiring. About the future of Mountain Pine. That sounds sensible, I reply carefully. She looks up at me, and for once, there's no judgment in her eyes, just a weary sort of clarity. I was wrong, she says, the words clearly difficult for her. Not just about the hotel, but about many things. When you got divorced, I thought you'd failed. When you focused on your career, I thought you were making a mistake. I wanted you to fit into the same box I did. I'm stunned into silence, having never expected this level of self-awareness from her. I'm not saying I understand all your choices, she continues. But this summit, it's remarkable. You've created something special there. Something entirely yours. It's not a full apology, and it doesn't erase decades of feeling undervalued. But it's a start. Thank you, I say simply. As we part ways, I walk back toward the summit, where my team is preparing for another successful season. The morning sun catches on the windows, making the building glow against the backdrop of mountains. I think about the journey that brought me here, the pain of being overlooked, the courage it took to strike out on my own, the joy of creating something that reflects my values and vision. I'm not just standing in my own light now. I'm creating it, sharing it, watching it grow brighter with each passing day. And that, I realize, is the true summit I've reached. Not just professional success, but the freedom to define my worth on my own terms. As I reach the hotel entrance, my phone buzzes with a message from Emma. Just booked my flight for next month. Can't wait to see you and the summit in full spring glory. I smile, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. The approval I sought for so long from my parents has been replaced by something far more valuable, the knowledge that I am enough, exactly as I am. My success, my happiness, they're mine, and no one can take them away. The spotlight burned into my skin as I stood frozen on the stage, staring at hundreds of shocked faces. My father's jaw had dropped. His composure, something I'd never seen him lose in my 32 years, completely shattered. My brother Michael's face had turned an alarming shade of red. And there I was, Ellen Martin, the unambitious middle child, holding the most prestigious award in Chicago's real estate industry. "This is Ellen Martin," Rachel's voice echoed through the stunned ballroom. "And if you haven't heard of her yet, trust me, you will." 3 minutes earlier, I'd been sitting anonymously at a back table. Now, my carefully constructed double life lay exposed before the entire industry elite, including my family, who had never believed I had it in me. The microphone waited. My moment of truth had arrived. Flashback. The family dinner. "You've always been so unambitious, Ellen." My father's voice cut through the ambient noise of Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. Warren Martin, owner of Martin Enterprises, one of the city's largest real estate empires, had a way of making even a celebratory dinner feel like a performance review. "Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues, and that's fine. But leave the real work to people like your brother." I carefully set down my fork, feeling the familiar trembling in my hands. The restaurant had been my father's choice. His company's 30th anniversary deserved someplace with proper tablecloths, he'd said. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, waiters in tailored suits hovered nearby, and I sat wondering why I still subjected myself to these dinners. And yet somehow, I replied, meeting his eyes, "Except for you, Dad, my unambitious self is the only other person at this table with a consistent track record of success." Michael smirked, that same dismissive grin I'd seen my entire life. He was 41, 9 years my senior, and had been groomed since childhood to take over the business. My father had built him up so thoroughly that Michael truly believed he deserved his position, despite the whispers throughout the industry about his reckless decisions. "Now, Ellen," my father chuckled, exchanging glances with Michael. "Let's not exaggerate. Success requires visibility. Leadership. You've always preferred to hide in the background." I could still remember the day my father took Michael to his first property acquisition at 12 years old, while I stayed home with my math tutor. "Business isn't about numbers," he told me. "It's about presence." A lesson my younger sister Charlotte had taken to heart, becoming the social butterfly who somehow transcended any expectation of actual contribution to the family business. Speaking of visibility, Charlotte chimed in, scrolling through her phone. "My brunch post got over 5,000 likes today. The restaurant's already called about a permanent influencer arrangement." My father nodded approvingly. Any subject was preferable to acknowledging my comment. The rest of the dinner passed in the usual blur, Michael boasting about a new property deal I knew was overpriced, my father beaming with pride, Charlotte's social media updates, and me, pushing food around my plate, wondering why I kept coming back for more disappointment. Flashback, the breaking point. "That location's a lost cause," Michael interrupted, not even letting me finish my second sentence. "We've already sunk too much into it. Let's move on." I stood at the head of the glass conference table, my carefully prepared presentation projected on the wall behind me. 30 pairs of eyes watched as my brother casually dismissed 3 weeks of my research. "I've actually found a way," I started again. My father waved his hand dismissively. "If Michael says it's not worth it, then it's not worth it. Next item." Just like that. Not even a courtesy moment to explain my proposal. I felt my face burning as the meeting continued around me, the other executives avoiding eye contact. This wasn't just another family dinner. This was a public humiliation in front of our entire management team. That property, a struggling mixed-use development in an emerging neighborhood, had potential no one else saw. I'd run the numbers, researched local market trends, identified the specific problems with its current setup, and developed a comprehensive remodeling plan that would have turned it from a liability into a flagship project. Hours later, I walked alone through a sudden spring downpour, my shoes splashing through puddles as rain mixed with the tears I'd been holding back all day. Water streamed down my face as a strange calm settled over me. I'd given them every chance. I'd earned top grades in school, graduated with honors from Northwestern's real estate program, worked my way through every department in the company. And still, they saw nothing in me. The rain soaked through my blazer as I made a decision. If they didn't want my expertise, I would build something they couldn't ignore. The first investment, The duplex looked worse in person than in the listing photos, which was saying something. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, water stains on the ceiling. It was exactly the kind of property my father would dismiss with a casual tear-down comment. But I could see what it could become. The neighborhood was changing, young professionals moving in, attracted by the proximity to public transportation and affordable prices. The bones were good, the layout functional, the problems largely cosmetic. It was all I could afford with my savings. My salary at Martin Enterprises was generous, but I'd never had my brother's expense account or my sister's brand collaboration income. This was entirely mine, a secret first step toward independence. Every weekend for 6 months, I worked on that duplex. I learned to replace fixtures, refinish hardwood floors, repair drywall. My hands grew calloused. My muscles ached, but every improvement filled me with a satisfaction I'd never known at my father's company. When I sold it a year later, the profit wasn't enormous, but it was mine. And more importantly, it proved my instincts were right. Meeting Rachel. "So you're the mysterious Ellen Martin," the woman said, extending her hand. "Sarah speaks highly of your investment instincts." Rachel Porter stood in the duplex's newly renovated kitchen, running her fingers along the quartz countertop I'd just installed. She was about my age, with a confidence that filled the room and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Our mutual friend Sarah had arranged the meeting after hearing both of us talk about real estate opportunities others were missing. I was cautious. This was my private project, separate from my family name. But I needed a partner with complementary skills if I wanted to grow. "I prefer working behind the scenes," I said carefully. Rachel smiled. "And I prefer being the face of things." Seems like we might balance each other out. There was something about her directness that put me at ease. Unlike the politics-filled interactions at Martin Enterprises, Rachel spoke plainly, asked intelligent questions about my renovation choices, and shared her own experiences navigating Chicago's real estate market as a woman with immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything for her education. "Why are you doing this on your own?" she asked finally, sitting at the kitchen island. The Martin name could open a lot of doors. I hesitated before answering. "Have you ever had your ideas dismissed so many times that you start to question your own judgment?" She nodded slowly. "More times than I cared to count. I needed to prove to myself that I was right, that I could succeed on my own terms." Rachel studied me for a long moment. "I think we could build something remarkable together, Ellen. Something that would make them all sit up and take notice." It was the first time anyone in the industry had recognized my potential so clearly. The beginning of a partnership that would change everything. Double life. "Ellen, when's the last time you even stepped foot in the office?" my father asked, swirling his bourbon at another family dinner. "For someone with shares in the company, you sure do a great job of making yourself invisible." Michael chuckled. "Not that anyone notices, of course. It's not like we're missing your valuable contributions. If only they knew." That morning, I'd finalized the acquisition of our seventh property, a commercial space in an up-and-coming neighborhood that Martin Enterprises had passed on twice. Porter Real Estate had grown steadily over the past 2 years, with Rachel as the public face and me as the strategic mind behind every deal. "I've been busy," I said simply, taking a sip of water. "With what?" Michael snorted. "Your mysterious personal life? You don't even post on social media. Charlotte puts more effort into choosing brunch spots than you do into your career." I thought about our growing portfolio, the team of talented people we'd assembled who valued my insights, the investors who trusted our judgment. A strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. They had no idea that the irrelevant daughter was becoming one of their strongest competitors. My two worlds existed in perfect separation. At Martin Enterprises, I was the forgettable middle child who attended mandatory meetings and disappeared the rest of the time. At Porter Real Estate, I was the visionary who transformed overlooked properties into successes. Sometimes I wondered what would happen when these worlds inevitably collided. But as my father and brother continued belittling my absence, I realized I no longer feared that moment. Part of me was beginning to look forward to it. "The award night. You've earned this night, Ellen," Rachel insisted, holding up an elegant black dress. "Your strategic vision is why we're finalists. Be there to see their faces when Porter Real Estate wins." I hesitated. Industry galas were my father's and brother's natural habitat, places to network, to be seen, to remind everyone of the Martin name. I preferred analyzing market trends and property valuations from the quiet of my office. They probably won't even notice me, I said, taking the dress reluctantly. Rachel gave me a knowing look. That's about to change. The ballroom was everything I expected, opulent, crowded with the city's real estate elite, filled with the buzz of deals and gossip. I spotted my father and Michael immediately, holding court at a prime table near the stage, Charlotte beside them scrolling through her phone. Well, Michael said as I approached their table. Look who decided to show up. You know, Ellen, these events are for people who actually contribute to the industry. Be nice, my father muttered, barely glancing my way. Just try not to embarrass us. I swallowed my response and retreated to a table near the back where Rachel waited with our team. Throughout the evening, I watched my father's expression darken as award after award went to other companies. Martin Enterprises, once the undisputed leader in Chicago real estate, hadn't innovated in years. Then came the announcement that changed everything. And the final award of the night goes to the firm that has shown unparalleled innovation and excellence in the real estate sector. This year's winner is Porter Real Estate. Rachel squeezed my hand under the table before rising to accept the award, her composure perfect as always. My father and Michael exchanged confused glances. Porter Real Estate had been flying under their radar, too small to be considered real competition. Until tonight. Rachel's acceptance speech was gracious, thanking our team and partners. Then her tone shifted. This moment isn't just about me or even our team as a whole, she continued. It's about someone who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes, someone whose brilliance has been the driving force behind Porter Real Estate. My heart began to race. This wasn't part of our plan. Many of you may not know her name, but without her, we wouldn't be standing here tonight. The mind behind every deal we've closed, every risk we've taken, and every success we've earned is my partner and closest confidant, Ellen Martin. The silence was absolute before murmurs swept through the room. Heads turned in my direction. My father's face froze in shock, Michael's mouth hanging open. Rachel extended her hand toward me. Ellen, come join me. This moment is yours as much as it is mine. My legs felt impossibly heavy as I stood. The walk to the stage seemed to take forever, every eye in the room following my progress. I could feel my father and brother staring in disbelief as I climbed the stairs and stepped into the spotlight. Rachel handed me the award, her expression filled with pride. This is Ellen Martin, she announced, and if you haven't heard of her yet, trust me, you will. The confrontation. I didn't know, my father said quietly as we stood on the terrace outside the ballroom. The Chicago skyline glittered below us, the cool night air a relief after the intensity inside. I had no idea you were capable of all this. That's because you never bothered to find out, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. You and Michael were so busy dismissing me that you never saw what I was doing. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. My father had built his empire through sheer force of will, growing up in a working-class family where education was valued but connections were non-existent. He'd fought for every opportunity, bulldozing obstacles rather than navigating around them. That approach had worked for him, and he'd assumed it was the only way to succeed. I thought I was protecting you, he admitted after a long silence. From what? From failing. He turned to face me. This business is brutal, Ellen. I didn't think you had the killer instinct for it. I laughed softly. You confuse volume with effectiveness, Dad. I don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to be the most strategic one. He studied me with new eyes. No, he said finally. I suppose you don't. Doffer, my father arrived at my office exactly on time, his custom suit and leather briefcase projecting the same authority he'd wielded my entire life. But something was different, a subtle uncertainty in his bearing as he took in the modern space Rachel and I had designed. Rachel was already waiting in our conference room, poised and professional as always. I joined them, curious what would come next in this new chapter of our relationship. Ellen, Rachel, he began, sliding a folder across the table. I've spoken with the board, and we're prepared to make an offer to acquire Porter Real Estate. We believe your expertise would be an invaluable addition to Martin Enterprises. Rachel raised an eyebrow, glancing at me. That's a generous offer, Mr. Martin, but I think Ellen should have the first word. I didn't need to see the numbers. The answer had formed in my mind the moment he walked in. No, I said simply. My father's brows furrowed. He wasn't used to immediate rejection. Ellen, at least consider. No, I repeated, calm but firm. I've worked too hard to build something that's mine. I'm not giving that up to return to a company where I spent years being overlooked. I'm free now, Dad. And I'm staying that way. The silence stretched between us. For once, he couldn't argue, couldn't dismiss, couldn't control. My success stood on its own merits, independent of his approval or protection. Finally, he nodded, closing the folder and standing. I underestimated you, Ellen, he said, his voice quieter than I ever heard it. I won't make that mistake again. As he left, Rachel smiled across the table. What's next? I thought about the property near the loop we'd been discussing, the expansion plans we'd drafted, the future we were building, not in reaction to my family's dismissal, but according to our own vision. Everything, I answered. And for the first time, I truly believed it.